And yet, it was in this crisis that American civilization was forged. The nation, as we know it today, is unmistakably tied to the new order that emerged in the second quarter of the 19th century. So we're going to do two things tonight. First, we're going to examine this catastrophe, what caused it, and how the people were changed by it. And second, we're going to see how our culture, in particular our popular culture, was born out of this brutal transformation. In brief, here's what happened, just to summarize. A transportation revolution that began with the Erie Canal kicked off a rising tide of economic inequality. The Industrial Revolution began to replace the traditional craft economy. Class barriers grew steeper and much, much more antagonistic. Second, the beginnings of mass immigration greatly amplified these new divisions, and soon the old, relatively mild class system of merchants and craftsmen began to give way to something new and much more hostile, the 19th century urban bourgeoisie and proletariat. New York City's responses to these developments, as expressed in our entertainment and in print, came to dominate the national imagination. Now, why is that? Is it because we're so much smarter and more talented than everyone else? So glad to hear you say so. But I have to disagree. I mean, otherwise we'd be done for the night, you know? New York's ideas dominated because of the easier travel offered by the Erie Canal, because it meant lots of new opportunities for sending newspapers and other printed material around the country and for traveling entertainment troupes. And in America's formative era, New York City took the lead in these areas, and the city's cultural dominance of the nation dates from that moment in our history. And that's why the city's response to the economic and cultural crises of this time became the basis for so much of our national discourse and so much of our national imagination. Amazingly enough, as you will see, these defining changes largely occurred right where we are at this very instant. You know, a city full of underpaid workers and starving immigrants was an unstable place. Big surprise. Violence could break out at any moment, and it frequently did. So, increasingly afraid of the poor, the owning class separated themselves as much as possible. They moved to exclusive new neighborhoods like around Bond Street and Astor Place. The city began to develop elite opera houses and expensive restaurants. In other words, places reserved for the wealthy alone. And in years to come, this succession of the successful would include Central Park, which was built in the 1850s mainly as a place for the wealthy to escape from the hoi polloi downtown. You know, Central Park is called Central, but that's really a misnomer. At the time that it was built, it was miles and miles out of town. The trip there and back took a full day. Poor people had neither the time nor the money to get there. So prosperous New Yorkers had the park almost entirely to themselves in its early days. In short, the city's more or less shared public culture began to disappear. Take, for example, the changes in how Christmas was celebrated. Now, you may think that the American Christmas is an ancient tradition, but it isn't. Christmas was traditionally a time of what was called wassailing. In other words, a role reversal in which the poor waltzed into the houses of the rich and had to be fed high-quality food and liquor. But starting in the 1820s, New Yorkers like Clement Moore, the author of "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," deliberately recast the season into a day at home with the family, safe behind closed and locked doors. The traditional role reversal was devoted to a different category of dependents. Instead of the rich serving the poor, parents served their children, an array of treats and presents and toys, and thus came our modern secular Christmas and its avatar, Santa Claus, as a way for New Yorkers to avoid allowing the great unwashed into their homes. And let me tell you, "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" was a smash, monster hit. It traveled around the country in a flash, and by 1840, Christmas in America had been transformed forever. Prosperous people everywhere welcomed the poem's justification for shutting down the wassail tradition. Now, the egalitarian strain of the American Revolution suggested that maybe there was something wrong with these tremendous extremes of wealth and poverty, and this could be a disquieting thought for the prosperous American. One way to deal with this is to dehumanize the poor, to make them seem less entitled to equality, with less of a claim to your consideration, and the primary way that America evolved for doing exactly this was ethnicity. The fears of the wealthy became specially targeted at the Irish. They were poor, they were Catholic, they were the big problem. And that was the great favor that the great immigration offered prosperous Americans, the opportunity to disdain the poor, not because they were poor, that might not be nice, but because they were different. From the point of view of them, the so-called swells, the downtown mobs, were pretty much all alike. They were proletarians, five-pointers, Lower East Siders, or more pointedly, bums, vagrants, and criminals. And to this blanket rejection, the 5 points returned disdain for disdain instead of striving for respectability, which, frankly, they weren't going to get anyway. They developed their own identity, their own language, their own entertainment, and their own sense of style. So while the swells amused themselves on high-class Broadway, the Bowery, 2 blocks that way, evolved into a separate entertainment district for the working class. And here's the curious thing. The class acts of early Broadway vanished long ago, but the more nasty Frank fare of the Bowery is what became the foundation of American pop culture right up to today. So why were the mosaics so popular? Well, consider this. Mose bowed to no man, and the climax of his tales invariably featured Mose defeating the forces of evil by beating the bad guy to a bloody pulp. The working class had a hero of its own at last. What's more, Mose lives on today. Take his playwright's description of this character. Listen, his jaw protruded into a half-beastly, half-human expression of contemptuous ferocity. Put that together with the heavy medallions, the song's braggadocio about his skillful hose and whatnot. And where are we if not this? The rap artist of today who uses his physical and verbal skills to boast of his extraordinary manhood. Or you've got this. Now, I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, I am not saying that guys like Ghostface actually modeled themselves after a fictional butcher from 150 years ago. No. What I'm saying is this. Today's working class heroes inhabit a cultural space that was carved out back then. And maybe, just maybe, the seemingly disparate strands of our culture aren't as far apart as we think they are. In fact, our popular culture is full of working class imagery, from gangster rap to the truck driving man of country music fame, from Rocky Balboa to John Travolta's character in Saturday Night Fever, or even the original guitar hero, Johnny B. Good, who never ever learned to read or write so well but could play the guitar like ringing a bell. This democratic imagery began in New York City in the 1840s, blurted out across the nation through the burgeoning national press. Okay, let's wrap up for the night. Here's what we've done. Here's what we've covered today. Our American social class system, in which the wealthy are heavily separated from the working class and poor, originated in the collapse of the craft system of labor in the 1820s and 30s. Amplified by the mass immigration that began just afterward, the nation's formerly more or less unitary public culture fractured, and the craft workers became proletarianized, and as they were forced to merge with the desperately poor, they developed a new system of cultural references which spoke from a working class point of view in minstrelsy, in theater, and in print, and especially via the mosaics. Thanks to New York City's leadership role in the national transportation and information systems, our local products traveled the nation and became huge business, the progenitors of today's popular culture. And since today, American pop culture is America's biggest business and our biggest export, popular all over the globe, I think it's fair to say the craft workers of the 1830s may have lost the battle against proletarianization, but they won the war for the soul of this nation. And that, as Mose might say, ain't no bunk, buddy. Thank you.